Good morning and welcome to the Fall 2020 series of Bridges Academy. My name is Lauren Humaneski and I plan Bridges Academy, and we're so happy to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. Please note that we will have a period for Q&A at the end of the session. You may submit questions through the chat feature. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom chat or your Zoom screen, you should see the chat icon. And if you click that icon, you'll have the ability to type and submit your questions there. Bridges Academy is a continuing education lecture series for lifelong learners hosted by the University of San Diego's Office of Planned Giving. You all have a tremendous impact on the University of San Diego. The Bridges Endowed Scholarship, supported by the attendees of Bridges Academy, has been awarded to 2 students per year over the last 15 years. We are so grateful for your support and generosity and so happy to have you as part of the Torero family. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Rebekah Wanic now. Dr. Rebekah Wanic graduated with honors, earning her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Illinois and her master's and PhD in psychology from UCSD. Her areas of interest are applied social psychology, social cognition, and gender. The focus of her master's was developing the subordination reactivity hypothesis to help explain health disparities across genders based on differences in relationship-based power. Her doctoral work focused on exploring social comparison and body image with the aim to identify cognitive strategies to reduce the negative impact of media and peer exposure. She has spent the past several years supervising student research on a variety of different topics and teaching courses including introductory, cognitive, and social psychology, gender, criminology, psychology and the law, statistics, industrial and organizational psychology, and research methods at several of San Diego's colleges and universities. At USD, Dr. Wanic is an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences, as well as the adjunct faculty liaison. Dr. Wanic, thank you for sharing a lecture with us this morning. We are so excited to have you here. I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. So I'm kind of a jack of all trades in terms of my background and teaching preparation. So Lauren didn't mention evolutionary psychology, but that's also one of the courses that I fairly regularly teach because it has a lot of overlap with several of the other areas where I've done research and taught specific classes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have some lecture slides prepared to just facilitate the talk. All right. So just to make sure everybody can see the lecture slides. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I know you're probably tired of people asking that question, but I feel like every time you're on a Zoom, it's set up slightly differently. So I just wanted to verify. So if you read the description, this talk is going to be about evolutionary psychology, and I titled it The New Foundation, Stealing Something from Darwin, who in his publication in 1859 on the origin of this species talked specifically about how his ideas would influence psychology or should influence psychology. And that was in 1859 that he published his work, but psychological sciences in general didn't really take hold of the evolutionary perspective, at least in terms of making it a real subfield until the 1980s. So it's a relatively young discipline with respect to the field as a whole. And so my purpose here is to just provide us with a little bit of an introduction into what is evolutionary psychology. And some of this might be redundant for people that are experts in evolution, but I'm going to go into just some of the basics to make sure that we're all on the same page before I look at a couple of different topics that we'll see are somewhat interrelated. So we'll talk a little bit about the role of evolution and psychology in family dynamics, something that many of us have experience with. We'll use that to kind of transition to what was historically seen as a problem, evolutionary perspective, altruism and cooperation. And then that will lead us into an understanding of the role of imagination, which helps to underlie our interactions with others. So to just kind of set the stage, when we think about psychology as a field, the simplest way that we can define it is using the scientific method to explore behavior and mental processes. So what we know from a plethora of research, and you know from your own experience, is that everything that we do depends in part on who we are and the underlying psychological mechanisms that we bring with us into every situation, but also contextual input from the situation itself. So I have on the slide here the cover, I think it's probably an old cover now, but of Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, which he subtitled The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And if you read the book or you're familiar with his ideas, what he's actually arguing is against the idea of the blank slate. So the blank slate has a lot of appeal, that we come into the world without any predispositions, which is, kind of ideal in the sense that then we can make ourselves into anything that we want to be. But what he presents and what evolutionary psychology argues is that we don't come into the world as blank slates. We come into the world endowed with a set of underlying psychological mechanisms that help facilitate our ability to interact with the world. And so the goal of evolutionary psychology is to then more fully explore, what are these inherited mechanisms from the evolutionary past? And the evolutionary perspective argues that those psychological mechanisms claim to be part of the evolutionary past exist because they facilitate our ability to solve adaptive problems. So what that means is we should expect to see a large number of the evolved psychological mechanisms, not just one or two, but many. And the reason why there need to be many is because they need to be both complex and specific. So I have an image of somebody who's not feeling so well to illustrate pregnancy sickness, which is just one example of a potential evolved mechanism that's complex and highly specific. So if you're familiar at all with sickness during pregnancy, it typically starts around 3 weeks post-conception and tends to peak during the first trimester, then wane during the second and third trimester. Pregnancy sickness is therefore specific to a woman's situation of being pregnant, but it's also highly complex and specific in the way that it operates, so that women don't typically experience nausea and avoid every food. It's oftentimes very specific to those types of foods that would be the most likely to expose the developing embryo to teratogens. So certain types of vegetables, for example, actually contain chemicals that are harmful to the developing embryo. What research evidence suggests is the reason why the pregnancy sickness tends to wane as we move into the second and third trimester is because the developing embryo, as it turns into a fetus, increases in its nutritional and caloric needs. So there's a high level of complexity and specificity to this simple, seemingly simple reaction of feeling nauseous when pregnant. So the idea is that we should see different types of mechanisms that allow us to be ideally suited to specific adaptive problems that we encountered in the past. And I'm going to talk about some other specific examples with respect to family, cooperation, and imagination moving forward. But before we get there, I want to just address some very common misconceptions about the evolutionary perspective applied to psychology. Lots of times people will wholeheartedly dismiss the field of evolutionary psychology or use it to make claims about humans that are just patently not true. So the first two are kind of interrelated. A lot of people misinterpret the evolutionary perspective on psychology as an argument that human behavior is genetically determined. And because it's genetically determined, we can't change it. So I mentioned that all behavior is the result of underlying mechanisms, which from the evolutionary perspective would be mechanisms that we have inherited, but it involves contextual input. So human behavior is never just a function of what we've been endowed with from our genetics. If you think about something like your height, genes determine how tall you can be, but where you actually end up is a function of your interactions with the environment. For example, your early nutrition, your early exercise. If you might have had a bone injury when you were young, that might potentially stunt your growth. So every outcome is a function of genes plus the environment. So we don't want to make strong claims human behavior is genetically determined. The other great thing about the interaction of genes and the environment is that things are changeable. If we can change environmental exposure, then we can change outcomes. The example that I was just giving you about pregnancy sickness would never occur if somebody never was pregnant. So, although that genetic predisposition exists, it's not necessarily going to be expressed unless appropriate environmental circumstances arise. And this is actually really encouraging. But sometimes people will say things, well, men are genetically predisposed to have multiple sexual partners, so you can't expect them to be faithful. Absolutely not true. Even if that tendency exists, you should still dump the person that cheats on you because they're not controlling their behavior and treating you appropriately. So the blank slate idea was seen as really appealing because it meant that we could turn people into more ideal, optimal versions of themselves. The evolutionary perspective is not disheartening in that we can't change ourselves, but what it's arguing is that we need to pay attention to how the predispositions might influence the way that we interact with the environment if we do want to work towards optimality. So I mentioned in talking about pregnancy sickness and evolved mechanisms in general, that the idea is that they should be relatively complex and highly specific. And so some people have argued, well, that can't be the case because all of these are really complex populations. But if you think about it, if I am a woman pregnant and I experience nausea in response to smelling something or tasting something, there is no complex cognition that's going on. It's a relatively automatic reaction. So just because the way the mechanism operates might be complex doesn't mean that I need to be doing anything complex on the cognitive level in order for it to operate. And I have on the slide a picture of a spider web as another illustration of this. Nobody would think that spiders are experts in architecture, in physics, in geometry, yet they're somehow still capable of spinning these really elaborate webs. So I mentioned this idea of optimality, and lots of people have the misperception that things that are altered through natural and sexual selection should lead to optimality in design. One of the things that we want to think about is, especially in terms of looking at human behavior as it exists currently, the environment in which we evolved was very, very different from the environment within which we operate today. And so, in the domain of evolution, we talk about what's called an evolutionary time lag, meaning that something that evolved thousands and thousands of years ago might have allowed us to function optimally back then, but it may not lead to optimality now. And just to give you a concrete example of that, you may be familiar with the idea of the availability heuristic, which is something that comes to us from cognitive psychology, our estimations of the frequency of events. So, what the availability heuristic tells us is that we tend to estimate as frequently occurring those things for which we can bring examples to mind quite easily. In the evolutionary past, that makes perfect sense because there would be a relatively strong relationship between how easy it is to bring something to mind and how frequently it occurred. The more it occurred, the more instances are available in memory, the easier it is for me to access that information. But what tends to happen now is that we overestimate the frequency of many events. For example, plane crashes, our risk of dying from terrorism, our risk of kids getting kidnapped, because those events are highly emotional, they're highly impactful, and we hear about every single one of them that occurs. So although they occur with relative infrequency, we hear about them on the news, we read about them online, they're emotional and they stick with us. So the mechanism that would have been optimal in the past no longer leads us to effectively estimate frequency because of the current environment, which is very different from the past environment. And then the last thing, which we'll touch on a little bit forward, is this issue of cultural invariability. So given that all humans that exist today theoretically arose from one small set of Homo sapiens in the past, the idea would be that if something is an evolved mechanism, then we should see it cross-culturally. Everyone in every culture should display this characteristic. And while we would want to see signs of cross-cultural consistency in establishing something as an evolved mechanism, it's not necessary because, as I mentioned previously, everything that we see as output is a function of our underlying psychology, plus environment. And the environments vary cross-culturally. They vary because of socialization, they vary because of ideology, they vary because of diet, they vary because of climate. So we wouldn't expect to see cross-cultural invariability in everything that humans are expressing as a consequence of genes plus environment dictating what we see. Okay, so that's kind of just setting the stage for thinking a little bit about where we don't want to go. So before we talk about a few specific aspects of the evolutionary perspective applied to psychology, let's just real briefly review the basics of evolution. So most people are familiar with the idea of evolution by natural selection, survival of the fittest, which requires some mechanism of inheritance. I need to have a way to pass this down from generation to generation. So when we talk about inheritance, we talk about genes. If I work out really, really hard and I develop a lot of muscularity, that's not going to benefit my children because that's me plus the environment. I might have a gene that makes it easy to add on muscles, but if my kids don't do the work, they're not going to get it, right? So not all characteristics that we display are things that can be operated on by natural selection. Next, we need variation. If there is no variability, there's nothing for selection to act upon because everybody would be exactly the same. And that's key for the last aspect, which is selection. So when we think about natural selection, thinking about is differential survival, differential success of just continuing to exist. And this is important, but what's more important from the evolutionary perspective is differential success in the mating arena. Because if I live a long, healthy life, that's fantastic for me, but nothing will get passed on to a future generation unless I'm successful in the mating arena. And so when we talk about the way that evolution operates, we don't want to forget the secondary process, which is sexual selection. And sometimes what we see in terms of displays of characteristics, both in humans and other species, are things that seem really non-optimal, but they play an important role in sexual selection. And the easiest example of this from the animal kingdom is peacocks. So male peacocks have a large, elaborate tail that is really cumbersome and really not great from a survival perspective. Why do they have it then? Because the female peacocks are really into that tail, right? And so if you are a male peacock and you want to get something from a female, the bigger and the more elaborate and beautiful your tail is, the more likely you are to be selected as a partner. Also, it's a sign to a potential future mate that you have the characteristics necessary to survive despite this thing that is hampering you, making you more obvious to predators, making it harder for you to move around, and so on. So it's important to think not just about survival, but also about adaptive problems associated with mating success, having offspring, and then bringing them to a place where they themselves can have their own offspring. So there were many, 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 many challenges that threatened both of these things, our success at surviving and our success at reproduction. And those threats come from many sources, including other humans, animals, and diseases and pests. So right now, we're all seeing the effects of diseases in that COVID has created all kinds of upheaval in our lives. What I want to focus on first, though, is that we are faced when interacting with other people, right? So I think some of the most interesting, for me at least, things about evolutionary psychology is what it tells us about the mechanisms we've inherited that facilitate or influence the way that we interact with other people. And we'll start small and look at some of the challenges that we face within our own families. So parenting and kinship are two big challenges, right? Parenting is a challenge in terms of figuring out who you might want to engage in this behavior with. And then once you have children, what do you do with them, right? And so what I have here is obviously a joke from Calvin and Hobbes, where he's looking at his parents saying, what assurance do I have that your parenting isn't screwing me up? And the answer is zero, right? But the parents could quite easily say to the child, what assurances do I have that you aren't screwing up my life? And the answer is, again, zero. So when we think about parenting, it's actually a giant challenge. And many, many species don't do it. They don't provide parental care at all. Right? So there are a number of species related differences that contribute to the amount of care and which parent or both parents, in the case of sexual mating, might provide care. So if we think about why we might not provide parental care, the number one thing that we want to focus on is cost. And cost from the evolutionary perspective is cost associated with survival or reproductive success. Right. So I have on the slide here, right? Somebody did a recent calculation of how much it actually costs monetary wise to raise a child currently. And it's upwards of $200,000. It's probably a low estimate depending on where your kid wants to go to school and whether they just decide to live with you again after they graduate from college, but rough estimate. It's very costly. And that's just money. That's saying nothing about the time that you have to put into raising children. So from the evolutionary perspective, if we think about the cost, one, every resource that I devote to my child is a resource that I'm not devoting to myself. So it's potentially costly in terms of my own survival. It's also costly because the resources that I am putting into current offspring are potentially preventing me from getting future mating opportunities. If another potential partner comes along and they see that I'm being burdened with spending resources on offspring that I currently have, they might choose a different alternate partner. And then finally, all of the care that I'm providing for one child is care that I cannot provide for another child. And so there are lots of evolutionary related issues associated with the distribution of resources in the context of families, in particular with respect to parental care. So if we think then specifically about this idea of the complexity, the specificity, what types of mechanisms would arise related to the evolution of parental care, they should be sensitive to, I'm just boiling them down to three basic things. One, genetic relatedness. So I have on the slide here a picture of the stepmother from Cinderella, and we have many tropes about the evil step parent. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. Why would the step to spend as much on offspring that are not genetically theirs? They're not carrying any of my genetic material forward, right? And what research evidence suggests is that in terms of both financial resources and affectional resources like time, attention, those types of things, stepchildren on average get less from non-biological than from biological parents. This is, of course, not to say that no step parent can be a fabulous parent. There's many fabulous step parents that are out there. But from an evolutionary perspective, if we look at this pattern of the data, it makes sense. I don't want to be devoting resources to offspring that are not mine. So mixed families tend to have a lot of contention as a result of this. So the second thing is my devotion of resources, attention, and care should be affected by the ability of this particular offspring to convert that into fitness. And that's just a complicated way of saying, is the resource that I'm providing to my child going to allow them to move forward so that they can be successful and reproduce themselves? And so what I have up here is a picture from an old security question that JetBlue used to use. I don't know if they still use it, but the question was, where you fill in like, what was the street that you lived on and what was your first pet's name in case you forget your password? One of them was, who is your favorite child? And so they're saying, you have one, right? So the idea is that parents should have a favorite child in terms of devotion of resources because they should devote the most resources to the child that's going to most effectively utilize those resources. And there's actually research evidence that supports this as well, looking at things like children who are sick, children who might have impairments, although of course parents can care and love for them and devote a lot of resources. Parents are more likely to have another child if they have an offspring who is sick. And this is true in both across species and in humans. And so the just general idea is that favorites might play out from an evolutionary perspective in terms of giving more attention to the child that you believe is going to make the most of it. And then lastly, I had mentioned on the other slide that one of the costs of care is that you can't devote those resources to yourself, to potential mating opportunities. You can also think about devoting resources to others who are genetically related to you, but not necessarily your own offspring. So I might choose to take care of my sister's kids with some of my resources rather than having kids of my own. And again, there's research evidence that supports this, that there are considerations of devotion of resources across offspring that may serve other purposes. For example, I know some of this probably sounds harsh, but researchers have identified what they call men who are of low mate value, meaning that they're unlikely to find a lot of future partners. So those low mate value males tend to devote more resources to their offspring. And what researchers have demonstrated is that that is in part not just taking care of the offspring, but it's in part a sign to their mate to stick around, that they're high quality, so they don't lose that mate, given that they might not be able to find another one in the future. So parental care is tied up in both survival and reproductive success, not just your own, but the potential success of your offspring as well. So I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about this idea of altruism and cooperation. And if we think about parenting from the perspective of giving up resources to support someone else's survival, we can think about what's called inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is just the idea that I can devote resources that benefit my genes by taking care of those who are genetically related to me. So we're just talking about parental care as one example of that, but care between siblings or care between other relatives. So grandparents taking care of grandchildren, aunts and uncles taking care of nieces and nephews. And what's interesting about this is what we see is that more care occurs on the maternal side of the family than the paternal side of the family. And from an evolutionary perspective, we can explain this because when a baby is born, there's zero question about who the mother is. There's sometimes potential question about who the father is, since we have internal fertilization. And so the idea would be that from the evolutionary perspective, I don't want to be devoting resources unless I'm relatively high in assurance that there's some sharing of genes. So on the maternal side, there's no question of who the parent is. But on the paternal side, there's a little bit more of a question. And so what research evidence has demonstrated is that there tends to be less close relationships between children and their paternal relatives compared to children and their maternal relatives. But what about care that occurs outside of the household, right? This is something that we're seeing quite a significant issue with respect to society in terms of people's motivation to take care of not just their own family, but others. So people initially argue that altruism, caring for others, at least outside of your family, was a problem from the evolutionary perspective, because what it basically is from the evolutionary view is a waste of resources. If I'm devoting resources to help somebody that's not genetically related to me survive, what benefit does that have for me from the evolutionary perspective? And others had argued that cheaters, so those who took and never gave, in a situation where some people were altruistic, would quickly outsurvive, outcompete those who cooperated, and then we would just end up with a bunch of cheaters. But altruism exists. People are nice. Or I shouldn't really say that altruism exists, because altruism, by definition, is giving up something without benefiting for yourself. So realistically, what we should talk more about is cooperation with individuals who we are not genetically related to. So helping that occurs outside of those that are related to us still serves some purpose. So it definitionally doesn't meet the criteria of altruism because I'm gaining something. And so one of the things that I can potentially do is provide assistance to others with signals to potential future partners, my quality. If I can afford to be generous and give gifts to other people, share my resources, then I must have quite a bit of resources. And so that is potentially something that is a signal of my quality to other potential mating partners. Similarly, displaying a positive social characteristic like generosity is a sign to a potential future mate that this person has a set of good personality characteristics that would make me want to be with them. So I can use helping, I can use cooperation as a way to potentially gain in the social sphere better, higher quality mates. The other way that being nice can help me is with reciprocity. And so in this domain, we talk about reciprocal altruism. I may not directly benefit from my initial act of helping, but if I can expect that you will help me at some point in the future, then I can expect to recoup that benefit. And so there will be reciprocity and we can maintain a pattern of cooperation. So, what this requires, though, is that there is going to be some interaction with individuals in the future. From the evolutionary perspective, early Homo sapiens lived in small units. So, we were easily able to keep track of the individuals with whom we were interacting, and we would expect to see them again in the future. Small groups make lack of reciprocity untenable because you typically will be punished for cheating the system. As our social groups have expanded and we interact more and more with individuals who we might not interact with again in the future, then we would expect to see less of a push for reciprocal altruism. What researchers have also argued is that if we think about cooperation in general, this is true of reciprocal altruism, but also just general helping, is that oftentimes what you see is what we call gains in trade. So I might give up a little now. It might be incredibly beneficial for you, so that the cost to me is less than the benefit to you. And then that might be reciprocated to me again in the future. So just to give you a real simple example, let's put ourselves back in the evolutionary past where we were hunting and we killed some big game. I could choose to hoard the meat, not share it with anybody, but I might notice that some of the members of my group are going hungry and they might be potentially near death. The small amount of meat that I'm going to share with them is incredibly beneficial to them and not all that impactful for me because realistically, I don't have a refrigerator or a freezer to keep this stuff. So at some point, it's going to rot anyways. So the gain in trade is something that should facilitate cooperation as well, that most acts of helping, most acts of cooperation are not ones that are going to put me at risk of death in benefit of someone else. So a way that this has been studied that you might be familiar with is what's called the prisoner's dilemma. And it's typically explained in terms of actual criminals who might go to jail, which is why it's called the prisoner's dilemma. But the idea is that you have two people who have gotten in trouble. So they've been taken into the police station and they're each going to be questioned separately in separate rooms. And they're told, these are your options, right? You can cooperate with us. You can give us information about your partner. And if you give us information about your partner, then you get to go free, but your partner is going to go to jail. But both of them are given this deal. And so the issue is, well, what if they both rat on the other? Well, if they both rat on the other, then the police are going to know that both of them were involved and they're both going to get punished. So the contingency is if you both rat on each other, then you're going to serve fewer than if only one of you rats on the other. But the best option, right, if we look at this here, the best option is if you both stay silent. You don't say anything about the other person's involvement. Cooperation leads to the best joint outcome. But the way that this scenario is set up is that defection actually leads to the best individual option because you can't talk to the other person. You don't know what they're going to do. And so you have to assume that they're likely to defect, because if they defect and you don't, they go and you get 3 years in jail. The problem with this for applicability to the real world is that this isn't typically the way that we interact with other people. We have conversations with other people. And what we were just discussing in the context of altruism and reciprocal altruism is most of the time it's not a one-off interaction. What we need to do to make this kind of dilemma more relevant to understanding cooperation in the real world is to make it what's called an iterated dilemma. Iterated just means repeated. So what some economists did back in the early 80s was they asked a bunch of people to generate a computer program to play this game. And it wasn't just going to be a one-time cooperate or defect. It was going to be iterated, that there were going to be multiple trials. And so what you could do was adjust your strategy based off of what the person you were playing did the time before. And so many, many different people submitted different strategies. And what's interesting is that a very simple strategy came out as the winner. And by winner here, I just mean that you're accruing the most points from this dilemma. So if we look at what the tit for tat strategy, the winner was, it was nice, meaning that it never cheated. It always cooperated, except when the partner cheated. Then it was retaliatory. So as soon as it was cheated against, it cheated right back, but it was forgiving. So if I'm cooperating and you cheat, I cheat to punish you. But if you say, oh, they caught me, I'm going to go back to cooperating, then this strategy says forgive, go back to cooperating. And so using this explanation of understanding how we might be reciprocally interacting with each other, being a cooperator, being nice, being forgiving is a winning strategy. Now, the big problem with the Axelrod and Hamilton initial studies was that it was two computer programs playing against each other. So it also wasn't quite like the real world in that you couldn't talk to the other person. You couldn't have a discussion about why did you cheat on me? That really hurt my feelings, those kinds of things. And you couldn't switch partners, which we also can do in the real world. If someone's not treating us well, we can choose to interact with someone else. But the general idea is that cooperation from a strict evolutionary perspective actually does provide us with a lot of benefits. And what comes out of this larger body of research is a number of strategies that we can utilize to increase the likelihood that individuals will cooperate. So one of them is just teach people the value of reciprocity. Right? That's why I have sharing is caring here on the slide, right? This basic idea that we tell children actually is quite beneficial for both our own and others' individual success. Second thing it says is insist on no more than equity, meaning don't take more than what you should, because that creates a disparity. And when there's a disparity, people get upset because things aren't fair. Third thing, like we saw in the tit for tat strategy, respond to provocation and do so quickly so that individuals don't gain a benefit from cheating before they're punished. Cultivate a reputation as somebody who reciprocates. So if I am going to have interactions with new individuals, one of the things that we know about humans is we're gossips. We're social creatures. We talk about people. Oh, did you hear what so-and-so did? Did you know about so-and-so, right? And so the more that you can cultivate a reputation as somebody who reciprocates by being somebody who reciprocates, by being nice, by being cooperative, the better your chances are of sustaining good cooperative interactions with others in the future. And then the last one, it says enlarge the shadow of the future, right? The whole idea of this iterated prisoner's dilemma, reciprocal altruism, is that there is a future time period within which you're likely to interact with that person. So the more I expect the interaction to persist, the more likely I'm to continue being motivated to cooperate. Or as soon as I know our interactions are likely to end, I can cheat you on that last trial and be like, peace out, I don't have to see you again. right? And so a simple example I always tell my students is think about people when they get fired from their job. Why do they have to be escorted out? Because if they're not, they're going to destroy a bunch of stuff because the reciprocal altruism relationship no longer exists. There is no future at this company. So by getting people to imagine a prolonged interaction, you can help sustain their motivation to engage in cooperative activities. And part of what facilitates our ability to enlarge the shadow of the future, to think about how things might be moving forward, is imagination. So I wanted to end with imagination as a topic because I think it's a fun topic to think about, and it actually plays a gigantic role in our adult lives, but we don't think about it all that much. So imagination is our ability to construct mental images and to think about events when they don't exist in reality. So I have this picture of this fancy glittery unicorn because oftentimes when we think about imagination, we think about that it's focused away from reality. I can imagine things that couldn't possibly exist. However, it's important to think about the role that imagination plays in its reality focus. Lots of the imagination that takes place is part of our understanding of the way that the world actually operates. And we'll see that it's extremely valuable for promoting our own survival and success. So when we talk about imagination, looking at it through the evolutionary lens, we can think about it being reproductive, which is that I'm imagining an event that I actually had experience with. So I can think about and imagine what it's going to be like when I'm able to go back to teaching in person because I have actual experience with that. Or it can be constructive. A unicorn is something that's constructive, right? I can create an idea of what something would be like, even though I've never experienced it. I'm supposed to be moving to Singapore. If COVID ever allows me to do that, I can constructively imagine what my life would be like when I get over there. So it can be related to actual experiences or the construction of ideas about experiences that you haven't yet had. So imagination, we oftentimes think about kids. Oh, their imagination is running wild when they're children. Let's let them have fun playing. And one of the things that researchers have focused on is thinking a little bit more. I've already mentioned parenting is costly, but thinking a little bit more about childhood, particularly in humans, we have a really long childhood. Think about how long kids are dependent on adults in order for their ability to survive. So why have such a long childhood given that it's so costly? Well, it's a period for extensive learning, right? That's what we do when we're kids. We learn a whole bunch of different things. And one of the important things that we do when we learn is we learn about culture. We learn about the ways that we interact with other people, and we learn about the different ideas that our culture has. So one of the things that we have to learn as children is what's called status functions. And so I have it here, the generic idea of a status function is that X counts as Y in context C. This dollar bill is a piece of paper. If you give a dollar bill to a baby, let's say I give $100 bill to a baby, is that baby going to be like, sweet, yes, I'm going shopping? No, it's going to crumple it up and put it in its mouth, and you just wasted $100. That baby has not yet learned the status function of that particular green piece of paper. And there are many, many things that are part of culture that have status function. They have meaning unique to the culture and meaning unique to a particular context. What kids do when they're young is they acquire a lot of this information early on through imitation. They imitate what adults do, and they actually engage in what's called over imitation. They imitate more than what's necessary. And a kind of silly example of this is if you watch those like little league baseball games, you see kids doing all kinds of like ridiculous things that adult baseball players do, like moving their gloves and tapping the ground with their bat and adjusting their hats and all of that stuff, chewing gum and spitting when you used to be able to chew tobacco and spit. Why are they doing that? It serves no purpose, no functional purpose to be better at baseball, but it's over imitation. It's helping them to figure out what is and is not part of what's necessary to survive in this particular culture. So pretend play is another important part of childhood that uses imagination. And in this context, imagination is helpful in contemplating a potential future, but it's also very valuable in helping me to learn to interact in a shared reality with other people. So lots of kids engage in pretend play with other kids. So you're generating new scenarios, you're problem solving within those new scenarios. So if these kids are pretending that the hammock is a ship and there's a shipwreck, they would have to figure out what to do in the event of a shipwreck. And there's a shared sense of imagined reality with their friends. What research evidence suggests is that the more that kids engage in pretend play when they're young, the more successful they are as adults in terms of social success and adaptability. So imagination in childhood plays an important role in us to learn how to adapt to the environment. And imagination is also helpful in adulthood, right? So thinking about the potential consequences of actions can allow us to cost-free evaluate what would happen, right? So if I'm sitting there thinking about as I'm walking, wow, there's a big rock, I kind of want to lift it up, but I know this is an area where there's a lot of snakes. I can imagine what would happen if I lifted it up and there's a snake underneath, and maybe choose not to engage in that action. Can help me think about how to make decisions, how to problem solve. If you've ever done a pro and con list, thought about, can I see myself doing this in the future? Those are ways that imagination is facilitating your ability to make decisions and solve problems. And you can think about, what's the best way for me to potentially interact with another person? So the we need to talk is dreadful, right? Let's say that I wanted to tell my partner that I wanted to break up with them. I might run through several different scenarios of what's the best way to do this, where should I do this, how are they likely to react, so that I can try to get the most optimal outcome out of this potentially unpleasant event. So imagination is important in helping us as adults to facilitate our interactions and make good decisions. And then thinking about relationships and adulthood, this wouldn't be a talk about evolutionary psychology unless I talked about sex just once, right? So think for a minute, use your imagination. What is worse? Is it worse to have your partner sleep with someone else? Or is it worse to have your partner fall in love with someone else? And you have to pick one of the two. So what research evidence suggests is that men and women view this differently. Men are more likely to pick the first part, to say that it's worse to have your partner sleeping with someone else, whereas women are more likely to say that it's worse to have your partner fall in love with someone else. And the explanation comes from adaptive problems in the evolutionary past related to mating and parenting. Women, we know, are not confused about who is the mother of the baby. It's theirs if it comes out of their body. Fathers, there's always a potential question. So paternal uncertainty would make men more worried about their partner's sexual fidelity. Women oftentimes bear the brunt of the child rearing, and they need resources devoted by the mother to help. So him falling in love with else is potentially more damaging, because if he's emotionally attached, then likely he and his resources will be moved over to that other partner. But the sex part of things then might not be so bad. So how does this play into imagination? Well, what researchers have argued is that what might help to underlie this gender difference is differential ability to imagine your partner engaging in sexual activity with somebody else. And what research evidence has demonstrated is that men are more likely to have vivid, explicit, imagined scenarios of sexual infidelity, which correlate with their level of upset. So the more easily I can imagine this, the more upset I am. And from the evolutionary perspective, this is fantastic, because it's going to cause you to engage in behaviors like mate guarding that will protect you from having to experience your partner sleeping with somebody else and potentially be devoting resources to a child that's not yours. So I mentioned that imagination in adulthood plays a significant role in our ability to interact effectively in our environments. And so if you've read the book Sapiens, one of the things that the author talks a lot about is this idea of how much of modern society exists in the world of imagination. So, this is one of his quotes. He says, "Modern business people and lawyers are, in fact, powerful sorcerers. The principal difference between them and tribal shamans is that modern lawyers tell far stranger tales. Just try to imagine how difficult it would have been to create states or churches or legal systems if we could only speak about the things that really exist." And so, to give you an example, Google, this is the little symbol for Google, but where is Google? What is Google? It's a company. They produce things. Their headquarters are located in a particular location, but Google in and of itself it's a fiction, right? A company is a fictitious entity. But our understanding of companies and the role that they play in society is very, very important. The United States is a location on a map, but where in reality does it exist? Is it the whole country? Is it the ideology of the country? Is it the government of the country? So his argument is that a lot of what we do is shared fictional reality that exists in our shared ability to imagine things that can't be physically present in reality. And so if you haven't read the book, I would highly recommend that you read the book. And there are a number of different ways that you can read it. I, of course, was reading it through the evolutionary psychology lens, but it's a fascinating look at how imagination helps to facilitate a social order. And the more that people break down their buy-in to these imagined fictions, the harder it is to get people to operate cooperatively. So, in sum, then, the evolutionary argument is that human beings have a host of psychological mechanisms that help us interact with other people and the world. And they exist in the way that they do currently, largely because they help to facilitate our survival in the past. So, we are not optimally designed for the present environment. We are designed to be functional. Are humans still evolving? Yes, they are. Will our psychological mechanisms change? Yes, they will. Interesting thing is that memory is starting to show some differences in that people are starting not to remember information, but to remember more where to find information. And as a professor, I'm sure you can imagine this is incredibly frustrating because we want students to remember the information, not where to find the information. But so the idea by going over some of those misconceptions is that we really want to understand what the evolutionary perspective is arguing. Not that we're optimal, not that we're genetically determined, but that we have mechanisms that help facilitate our ability to utilize the environmental input effectively. So we talked a little bit about cooperation and altruism, looking at some of the issues of contention within families and potential issues that might interfere with effective cooperation between individuals that we're not related to. And then lastly, we spent some time looking at issues associated with imagination. And hopefully you were able to get a new appreciation for the potential to imagine things even in adulthood, how much it helps to facilitate our ability to solve problems, to make decisions, and facilitates our ability to continue interacting effectively in a highly complex, highly imaginary social order. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for a great lecture. And at this time, we will begin a few moments of Q&A. I had a few questions that came in. If anybody else has remaining questions, feel free to chat them in or let me know that you have a question. And thank you again for a great lecture. The first question we have is, what are some criticisms or limitations of evolutionary psychology?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. So one of the big criticisms is we can't test it in the same way that we test other psychological phenomenon because we can't go back and experimentally manipulate human beings tens of hundreds of thousands of years ago and see how they turned out. So criticisms of the field are that some of the claims are what we call just so stories, that you're just making up a story that sounds really good and it fits, even though there's no evidence behind it. I cut from my lecture a little overview of the way that evolutionary psychologists gather evidence, but it's an interdisciplinary field, so that you wouldn't want to make a claim just from doing one survey online. You would want to collect evidence from across cultures, look for genetic contributions, look for biomedical evidence, and so on. So criticism is that it's easy to come up with the stories. It's harder to sort of substantiate them with research. And then other things that people have criticized evolutionary psychology about is what I was sort of talking about with respect to the misconceptions, which is that people use the tenets of evolutionary psychology to support ideas that don't follow from what it actually argues, and to kind of sustain mistreatment of individuals. But thanks, that was a really good question.
Okay, thank you so much. Our next question is, the tit for tat strategy sounds like it has applications in international diplomacy and the business world. Do you know if that has been applied in that way?
So that neither one of those are my areas of expertise, but that's really intuitive assessment, and it is accurate. So when we are dealing with international business, what you have to get is an understanding of the other person's sense of what is and is not fair, what does and does not count as cheating and cooperation. And so if there's a mismatch in terms of assessments of cooperation and cheating, then you can run into problems in international relations and in the business sector. But definitely punishment, it can be effective. The problem is that when we get punished, what do we feel? Angry, right? Think about yourself. If you get punished, or if you ever interact with kids, consequence of punishment is not. So tit for tat works best when both parties operate on a tit for tat, which is kind of like the recognition that, like, oh yes, I did something wrong and the punishment is what I deserve. I'm going to not operate out of anger. I'm going to go back and be a cooperator so that things can go back to normal. Unfortunately, not everybody is of that same mindset. And there are lots of people that are bullies who don't feel the need to kind of make any accommodations and react quite strongly when they're called out and punished. And so diplomacy requires something that's usually a little bit more complex, just because of the lack of kind of parity when the negotiations typically begin. But great question. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. And the final question I see that came in was, you discussed the care or love that the parent would have for their offspring. What about the other direction? How would the evolutionary perspective explain the love that a child has for their parent?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a really intuitive question as well. So you might be familiar with Harry Harlow's studies with the rhesus monkeys, where he was testing Freud's idea that love between children and parents came because parents met their basic biological needs. But what Harlow's studies showed, so if you recall, he had baby monkeys that were reared with a cloth mother that provided them with contact comfort, or a wire mesh mother that wasn't comfortable to hang on to, but had a bottle that fed the monkeys. And the monkeys really were attached to, and he has lots of evidence that demonstrates this affectional attachment to the cloth mother. And so what research evidence suggests is that the thing that facilitates the love that children typically feel towards their caregivers is security and affection. So yes, meeting your biological needs is important, but feeling comforted, feeling secure, feeling protected are the key characteristics. And then as we get older and we no longer need our biological needs to be met as much, that's what kind of sustains the relationship. And so a lot of strained parent-child relationships occur because a lot of the focus is on using resources to substitute for the display of affection. And so like lots of people are familiar with the idea of like the Disneyland dad or the grandparent that buys the kids all of the gifts. And so that might create a surface level of attachment, but without the real affection and security, oftentimes the parent-child relationship will become more strained. But thank you. That was a great question.
I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us this morning and for offering a great Bridges Academy lecture. We are so appreciative for your time and for you being here. And so I just wanted to thank you for that. I know everybody was really appreciative of your lecture.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I know this is a little bit awkward and it's hard to kind of to lecture on here. So I hope I had enough enthusiasm.
Great. That was so great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here this morning.
Yes,
Our final Bridges Academy lecture of the semester is next week on November 18th. So please join us. You may learn more about it and register online at sandiego.edu/bridges. And Dr. Wanic, thank you so much for being here again. And we wish you the best.
thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.